Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. In the sun-drenched halls of ancient Sparta, a young woman named Helen discovers that her face is a currency she never asked to spend. While the world remembers her as a myth, she was a girl living in a palace of stone and bronze, surrounded by men who saw her as a trophy and women who saw her as a threat. The air around her is always thick with a specific kind of tension, the sound of voices dropping when she enters a room and the sharp, jealous glances of her peers. As she navigates the rigid expectations of her royal bloodline, Helen finds herself caught between the safety of a quiet life and a magnetic, dangerous desire to be seen for more than just her golden hair and perfect features. It is a story of heavy crowns, whispered secrets, and a beauty so intense it felt like a storm waiting to break. Chapter 1: The Girl in the Bronze Mirror. Helen spent a lot of time looking at her reflection, but not because she was vain. She did it to understand why the world reacted to her like a sudden flame in a dark room. In the dim light of the palace, she leaned toward a polished bronze mirror. The surface was slightly warped, but it couldn't hide the symmetry of her features. Her skin had a natural glow that made the expensive oils the other girls used look like thick, sticky grease. She touched her cheek and wondered why her appearance made her father, King Tyndareus, so nervous. Whenever Helen walked through the courtyard, the rhythm of the palace changed. The soldiers sharpening their bronze spears would stop, their whetstones going silent. The servants carrying heavy water jugs would lose their footing, spilling precious liquid over the dusty floor. It was a logical system of cause and effect. Helen moved, and the world paused. Even her own sisters, Clytemnestra and Timandra, had started to treat her differently. They didn't invite her to whisper about the boys in the village anymore. Instead, they watched her from across the room with tight, forced smiles. Today, the palace felt especially crowded. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and the sweat of traveling horses. Her father had called a gathering, and Helen knew it was about her. She watched a group of young noblemen through a high window. They were arguing, their voices rising in a messy scramble for dominance. They weren't even talking to her. They were talking about her as if she were a piece of land or a fine horse. In the modern world, we might call this celebrity, but for Helen, there were no cameras or fans. There was only the weight of 1,000 eyes and the feeling that she was disappearing behind her own face. She turned away from the mirror, the bronze cold against her fingertips. She wanted to be a person, but the men downstairs were already turning her into a legend. She took a deep breath and prepared to walk into the hall, knowing that as soon as she crossed the threshold, the room would fall into that heavy, suffocating silence she had come to loathe. Chapter 2: The King's Heavy Choice. King Tyndareus was a man who preferred simple problems like a broken chariot wheel or a leaky roof. But his daughter was a problem that logic couldn't fix. He sat on his wooden throne, rubbing his temples as the noise in the great hall reached a fever pitch. Every prince in Greece had arrived at his doorstep, and they all brought gifts that were starting to pile up like a mountain of clutter. There were crates of fine wine, rolls of dyed wool, and stacks of shimmering armor. The hall was a chaotic scene of ego and gold. These men were rivals who usually spent their time raiding each other's cattle, but now they were forced to share the same benches. The tension was like a stretched bowstring. One wrong word about Helen, or one boastful comment about who deserved her more, and the palace floor would be covered in blood. Tyndareus looked at the crowd and saw a group of men who weren't looking for a wife. They were looking for a victory. Helen watched the scene from the shadows of a balcony. She saw Agamemnon, a man who looked like he wanted to own the entire world, and Menelaus, his quieter, sturdier brother. She noticed how the suitors checked each other's equipment, comparing the shine of their shields and the length of their swords. It was a high-stakes game of status. To them, Helen was the ultimate status symbol, a way to prove they were the greatest among their peers. The king's anxiety was palpable. If he chose one man, the other 49 would burn his city to the ground in a fit of jealous rage. He needed a way out of this trap. He looked over at his advisors, but they were just as stumped as he was. The social dynamics of the room were shifting toward a disaster. Helen leaned against a cold stone pillar, feeling the irony of her situation. She was the most sought-after woman in the world, yet she had never felt more like an object gathering dust in a warehouse. Chapter 3: A Pact Made in Secret. While the other suitors were busy shouting and showing off their muscles, one man sat quietly in the corner. This was Odysseus. He wasn't the tallest or the richest, but he was observant. He saw the way the king's hands shook when he held his wine cup. He also saw Helen watching from the balcony. He realized that this wasn't just a wedding negotiation. It was a security crisis. Odysseus found the king in a private corridor later that evening. The torches flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. He didn't offer gold or horses. Instead, he offered a logical solution to the mess in the hall. He proposed an oath. Every man downstairs would have to swear to protect whoever Helen chose. If anyone tried to take her away or cause trouble, all the others would have to band together to stop them. It was a clever system designed to turn 49 potential enemies into 49 bodyguards. Helen happened to be nearby. Hidden by a heavy tapestry, she listened to Odysseus lay out the plan. It was the first time she had heard someone talk about her as a person who might have a choice. However, the choice felt hollow. The oath wasn't about her happiness. It was about preventing a war. It was a political contract wrapped in a romantic gesture. She stepped out from the shadows, startling both men. Odysseus didn't look at her with the same hungry gaze as the others. He looked at her with a kind of pity that stung more than the lust of the princes. He knew what this oath would do. It would tie her fate to the pride of every man in Greece. Helen looked at her father, who seemed to have aged 10 years in a single week. He looked relieved. The plan was perfect for him, but for Helen, it felt like the walls of the palace were moving in just a little bit closer. The deal was struck in the quiet dark, and the future of her life was sealed by a clever man's logic. Chapter 4: The Spartan Wedding Gift. The wedding was a blur of heavy incense and the rhythmic stomping of feet. Helen was married to Menelaus, the man her father chose because he was wealthy, stable, and most importantly unlikely to start a fight. Menelaus wasn't a bad man. He was kind in a quiet, clumsy way, and he treated Helen like a fragile piece of pottery that might shatter if he spoke too loudly. But as the months turned into years, the stability of Sparta began to feel like a heavy blanket on a hot night. Their life followed a predictable, logical system. Every morning, the sun hit the same corner of their stone bedroom. Menelaus would leave to oversee the grain stores or argue with the local lords about tax cattle. Helen would sit with her ladies, weaving endless patterns into woolen cloaks. In the modern world, we might call this a comfortable routine, but for Helen, it was a slow erasure of her spirit. She was the queen, but she felt more like a decoration in her own home. Menelaus tried to please her with gifts. He brought her ivory combs from the south and bracelets made of heavy gold. He would watch her wear them, his face filled with a simple, honest pride. He loved that she was his, but he didn't really know who she was. They sat at dinner in a comfortable silence that felt miles wide. Helen would look at the flickering oil lamps and wonder if this was all there was. Life of being admired but never truly known. She often walked the high walls of the citadel, looking out at the rugged Spartan mountains. She was safe, she was fed, and she was the most envied woman in the world. Yet there was a persistent ache in her chest, a quiet whisper that she was wasting away in the perfection of her life. She was waiting for something to happen, even if that something was a storm that would tear everything down. Chapter 5. The Guest from Across the Sea. The storm arrived in the form of a ship with painted eyes and purple sails. Paris, a prince from the distant city of Troy, walked into the Spartan court like he had stepped out of a dream. He was nothing like the Greek men Helen knew. While Menelaus and his friends were built of hard muscle and smelled of leather and sweat, Paris was elegant. He wore tunics of fine, shimmering silk, and his hair was scented with exotic oils that smelled like sandalwood and spice. When Paris was introduced to the royal couple, the air in the room seemed too thin. He didn't stumble over his words or look at the floor like the other suitors had years ago. He looked Helen directly in the eyes, a bold move that made the elderly advisors cough in discomfort. He brought gifts from the East, delicate glass vials, intricate gold jewelry, and stories of a city that was far more sophisticated than the rough stone halls of Sparta. Being a good host, welcomed Paris with open arms. He didn't see the danger. He only saw a young man from a wealthy family who wanted to talk trade and diplomacy. He invited Paris to sit at their table and sleep in their guest quarters. It was a standard system of hospitality, a sacred rule in their world. But as Paris spoke of the golden towers of Troy and the freedom of the Trojan court, Helen found herself leaning in just a little too far. The tension during those first few dinners was electric. Every time Paris reached for a piece of fruit or a cup of wine, his movements were deliberate and graceful. He didn't treat Helen like a statue. He treated her like a secret he was eager to uncover. The servants noticed the way the queen's hands trembled when she poured the wine, and the gossip began to spread through the kitchen like a slow-burning fire. Chapter 6. A Misunderstood Look. The climax of the visit came during a festival in the palace gardens. The air was cool, and the scent of crushed herbs filled the night. Menelaus had been called away to deal with a minor border dispute, leaving Helen to entertain their guest. They sat on a stone bench, the moonlight turning the white marble into something ghostly and beautiful. Paris wasn't talking about trade anymore. He was talking about the gods, about fate, and about how some people are born to be together. He looked at Helen and said nothing for a long time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating gaze of the suitors. It was an invitation. In that moment, a look passed between them, a silent understanding that their lives were about to collide. Helen's sisters, who were watching from a distance, saw the way her shoulders relaxed and how she tucked a stray lock of golden hair behind her ear. They knew that look. It was a look of recognition, and it was dangerous. The next morning, the palace felt different. The tension had shifted from a simmer to a boil. The servants whispered in the hallways, and the guards stood a little straighter when Paris walked by. Helen felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. She knew the logic of her world. She belonged to Menelaus, and her beauty was the glue that held the piece of Greece together. To break that bond would be to invite chaos. But as she watched Paris prepare his ship for departure, the weight of her Spartan life felt unbearable. The misunderstood look wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. She realized that she was tired of being the silent prize at the center of the room. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows over the harbor, Helen stood at her window and made a decision that would change the map of the world forever. Chapter 7: The Midnight Departure. The decision was not a loud explosion, but a series of quiet, frantic movements. Under the cover of a moonless night, Helen moved through the palace like a ghost. She didn't take much, just a few pieces of jewelry and a heavy wool cloak to shield her from the sea spray. The stone corridors of her home felt colder than usual, the shadows stretching out as if trying to grab her ankles and pull her back to her comfortable, stagnant life. At the docks, the Trojan ship was a dark silhouette against the black water. Paris was waiting, his face pale with a mix of terror and triumph. There was no grand romantic speech. There wasn't time. He reached out a hand, and as Helen took it, she felt the rough wood of the pier beneath her sandals for the last time. They moved quickly, the oars muffled with rags to keep the splashing quiet. It was a logical system of evasion, designed to get them past the harbor guards before the sun revealed the empty bed in the royal chambers as the ship pulled away. The distance between Helen and the shore grew. She watched the flickering torches on the Spartan walls until they were nothing more than tiny orange pinpoints. In the modern world, we might call this an elopement, but in Helen's world, it was an act of high treason. The air on the open sea was sharp and salty, biting at her skin. She sat on a wooden crate, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had finally escaped the cage of her reputation, but as the wind caught the sails, she realized she was heading toward a much larger storm. Chapter 8: The Long Blue Horizon. The journey to Troy was a slow, rhythmic test of patience. Day after day, there was nothing but the vast blue of the Aegean Sea and the steady thud of the oars. The ship was cramped, smelling of cedar, old rope, and the sweat of 50 sailors. Helen spent most of her time near the bow, staring at the horizon. The novelty of Paris's presence had begun to settle into a nervous reality. He was still charming, but the sea didn't care about his silk tunics or his beautiful words. Paris tried to keep her spirits up by describing the luxuries of his father's palace. He talked about the golden plates and the soft carpets of Troy, comparing them to the primitive stone floors of Sparta. But Helen noticed the way the sailors looked at her when they thought she wasn't watching. They didn't see a queen. They saw a burden. Every league they traveled was another mile of potential pursuit. The social dynamics on the small ship were strained. The men were tired, and the presence of the world's most beautiful woman was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The contrast to her life in Sparta was jarring. There, everything was heavy and permanent. Here, everything was fluid and uncertain. Helen felt a strange sense of displacement. She was no longer a wife, but she wasn't yet a citizen of Troy. She was just a face in the middle of the ocean. When the sun went down, the temperature dropped sharply, and she huddled under her cloak, listening to the sailors' low chants. She began to realize that she hadn't just left a husband. She had broken a system that kept her world safe. Chapter 9: The Walls of Troy. When the ship finally sailed into the Sihon Gate, the scale of Troy took Helen's breath away. The walls were massive, built of limestone blocks so large they looked like the work of giants. Unlike the rugged simplicity of Sparta, Troy was a city of color and noise. People crowded the streets in vibrant reds and deep purples, their voices rising in a chaotic hum. But as Helen walked through the city toward the royal palace, the cheers were muted by a heavy layer of suspicion. At the top of the citadel, the Trojan royal family waited. King Priam was kind, his eyes softening when he saw Helen's beauty, but his wife, Queen Hecuba, stood as stiff as a spear. To Hecuba, Helen wasn't a guest. She was a ticking clock. The Queen Mother knew the history of the Greek kings and the oath they had sworn. She looked at Helen's perfect features and saw the smoke of a burning city. The tension in the throne room was thick enough to touch, a sharp contrast to the celebratory feast Paris had promised. Helen was given a room that overlooked the sea. It was filled with the finest things the East had to offer: scented woods, soft furs, and silver basins. In the modern world, we would call it a luxury suite, but to Helen it felt like another gallery. The Trojan women who came to serve her were polite but distant, their eyes tracking her every move with a mix of awe and resentment. She was the most beautiful woman in Troy, but as she looked out at the water, she saw the first ripples of the trouble she had brought with her. Chapter 10: The Scorn of the Sisters. In the high, sunlit chambers of Troy, Helen tried to find her place. She spent her days with the royal women, but the atmosphere was as sharp as a bronze needle. Andromache, the wife of the Crown Prince Hector, was the heart of the Trojan court. She was a woman of duty and logic, and to her, Helen was a dangerous distraction. While they worked at their looms, the silence between them was heavy. Andromache's shuttle moved with a rhythmic, aggressive snap, a stark contrast to the gentle, hesitant way Helen handled the wool dot. The tension wasn't about broken dishes or simple insults. It was about the social system Helen had disrupted. One afternoon, while the sun beat down on the stone terrace, the conversation turned to the rumors of a Greek mobilization. The Trojan women looked at Helen with eyes that were cold and assessing. They saw her beauty not as a gift, but as a liability that their husbands and sons would have to pay for. Helen felt the weight of their judgment, a physical pressure that made the fine silk of her Trojan dresses feel like lead. She tried to offer help with the weaving, but the other women subtly moved their baskets away. They didn't want her help. They wanted her gone. The rivalry was unspoken but constant. Even in the modern world, being the new person is hard. But Helen was the new person who had brought a potential war in her luggage. As she walked through the gardens, she heard the whispers following her like the rustle of dry leaves. She was the most beautiful woman in the city, and she had never felt more like an outcast. Chapter 11: The First Ship on the Horizon. The Peace of Troy ended on a Tuesday morning when the sun caught a flash of bronze on the water. Helen stood on the high walls, her hair whipping in the sea breeze as the first Greek ship appeared on the horizon. Then came another and another, until the sea was covered in a forest of masts. It was a logical conclusion to the oath Odysseus had designed years ago. The system was working exactly as intended. The men who had once fought over her were now united against the city that held her. From her vantage point, Helen could see the familiar symbols on the shields. She recognized the banners of the men who had sat in her father's hall, drinking his wine and boasting of their bravery. Now they were here to claim her, not out of love, but out of pride. The contrast between the quiet, golden life inside the walls and the metallic, clanking reality of the beach was jarring. Below her, the Trojan army began to gather, their spears forming a thicket of wood and sharpened metal. The mood in the city shifted instantly from suspicion to survival. The men who had smiled at her in the market now looked past her, their faces set in grim masks of preparation. The drama of the court, the jealousies and the whispers suddenly felt small compared to the thousands of campfires lighting up the shoreline. Helen watched the first Greek tents being pitched in the sand. She realized that she wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a landmark, a reason for 1,000 ships to cross the sea, and the weight of that responsibility was almost impossible to bear. Chapter 12. The Face in the Firelight. As the first night of the siege fell, the city of Troy grew quiet, save for the rhythmic clanking of guards on the battlements. Helen sat by a small fire in her room, the orange light dancing across her features. She looked into a small, handheld mirror, but she didn't see the woman who had launched 1,000 ships. She saw a girl who had once just wanted to be known for something other than her eyes or her hair. The logic of her life had brought her to this moment, a crossroads where beauty had become a burden. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the Greek camphor, low hum of voices, and the occasional bark of a command. In the modern world, we can turn off the news or close our doors to the world's problems, but Helen lived at the very center of the noise. She thought of Menelaus, likely sitting in a tent on the beach, and Paris, who was sharpening his arrows in the hall below. Both men claimed to love her, yet their love had surrounded her with fire and bronze. She realized that her beauty had been a cage from the very beginning. In Sparta, it was a cage of expectations. In Troy, it was a cage of stone walls and angry whispers. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Helen felt a strange, cold clarity. She would survive this, but she would never be the same. The most beautiful woman in history was a title she would carry forever. But in the quiet dark of the Trojan night, she knew that the cost of that title was a peace she might never find again. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl through the towers, waiting for the morning to bring the first day of a very long war.